or in the evening. But I said, I can't. That'll be like 2 a.m. for me.
Has it been a good fellowship? Are you enjoying Rome?
Yeah, no, it's great. It's wonderful. The fellows are really good. And again, it's that thing of the interdisciplinary. It's so interesting. Yeah, there was just a little talk today. I mean, it's just so many different things. It's great.
I'm so glad. Off in the distance, I have 2 kids in middle school, so I can't go to Rome now. But someday,
Oh no, Idra, there are people here with children, families.
They brought the whole
It's
family.
so great. They give you an apartment. The kids go to school here. I mean, it is wonderful. You should think about it.
I have always thought I'm going to have to postpone any of those things until,
No. I mean, do you know Robin Schiff?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Nick Twemlow.
They're there?
Nick and their child are here. And there are so many. I mean, the kids are great. They're some of the best. They're just the best. They're like genius kids. It's wonderful. No, you should think about it. Having a family is actually better because you get a big apartment.
Wow.
You get
I
first
love
dibs
this
on the apartment.
information, Gina. I may have to contact you for more.
Do it.
I feel like I'm like on some sort of like permafrost freeze where I'm like slowly melting out of sight, where I'm like, I love my children, but I don't want to disrupt their lives. I want them, I want my sons to just have their friends and their identity here and then have stable childhoods, which because I moved around and it was so hard. So I sort of feel like I want for them stability that I didn't have so that then I can go run around down the road. But it's interesting.
Kids are thriving here. Kids are thriving because it's a lot of other kids are here. So they have their own park. The academy has a park for them, all of that. Think about it.
All right.
Okay, Bernard.
Hello everyone who's attending this event. I'm Bernard, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome all of you to PNP Live. So thank you for joining us in this virtual format in the midst of these continuously extraordinary times, throughout all of which we strive to continue to bring you the authors you love and their new books to our Politics and Prose community. So at any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase both TERCERA by Gina Apostol and Idra Novey's new book, whose title is escaping me right now. I'm
Take What You Need.
Yes, thank you very much. Take What You Need by Idra Novey. Both books are very excellent. Additionally, you can ask the author a question by clicking on Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And while we try to get everyone's questions, we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are also providing closed captions if you click on the CC link right next to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We're so thankful to our family of loyal customers, keeping our business and our spirits afloat. So for the main event, again, I'd like to welcome to PNP Live, Gina Apostol. Gina is one of my favorite writers, someone who is in my personal canon, who wrote such books as The Revolution, According to Raimundo Mata, and Insurrecto. She is the winner of 2 Philippine National Book Awards, the PEN Open Award, and the Rome Prize. So today we are celebrating the release of her new book, La TERCERA. The New York Times, in the review of the book, writes that La TERCERA is profoundly rewarding, opening up a glorious new understanding of a country and a culture that ought to mean more to Americans than a twinge of guilty conscience. And today, Gina will be joined by another favorite of mine, Idra Novey. Idra is a writer and translator. Her newest novel, Take What You Need, came out a few weeks ago and was named a New York Times Editor's Choice and a Best Fiction Pick for Spring by the Wall Street Journal. So everyone, let us welcome Gina Apostol and Idra Novey to PNP Live.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Bernard, for that
much.
lovely intro. Thank you to Politics and Prose. And thank you to Gina for reaching out to have this conversation together. And I loved your post that you did this morning about all the sort of thematic overlaps that we were both sort of thinking about at this time in our lives after having written several books. And, I think there's just like more lived experience that one can bring to one's writing after sort of exploring some issues about relationship to homeland or hometown. What happens when you are, 20 years out or 3 or 4 books out from childhood, and it's taken up this sort of new place in one's imagination or in one's vocabulary. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you see La Tercera, which is a longer novel, in terms of thinking about sort of distance from childhood and a distance from thinking of those relationships between a mother and a daughter when you are not seeing them as the child in the relationship, but you have been a mother yourself. And I think, people talk about parent relationships, and if you've only been on the child end, that's one way of seeing them. But if you've been both the child and the parent, I think you have a more complex understanding and perhaps more mercy for both sides of that relationship.
Mercy is a good word. Thank you so much, Idra. And, I'm so glad that we managed to have this conversation. I've been so taken by all your work, but this one, especially having done, La Tercera, and I was reading your work, I said, wow, it's fascinating where we've the different ways that the books connect. So thank you for that. Thank you for that comment on the journeys that we've been making. But that's a fascinating question. My daughter is now 31. My mom died in 2000, and I've written, this is my 5th novel. And then I go back to to this teeny tiny town that my mom came from that got electricity in the 1990s. I call it the Arakataka, the Bacondo of my life, and what does it mean to have had all of this material done, life lived, and then you go back to that? I do think there was something about the moment, the pandemic, where there's something that really became very dense, crystallized, and only important things are going to be, you're going to move with only these important things. And the important things can be quite difficult actually to grasp and handle. But the weird thing is that the important thing became something like making my childhood real to me again. It's like making my childhood real to me again. I've been living in New York for so long, and that world is so separate and different. It was separate and different even when I was living there. That town. So to go back to that and to just try to speak to the details, the physicality, the materiality of that world, ended up again being about language, that the language is really where I always come to as a kind of real, a kind of reality that for me is, I think about the relics that I'm seeing in Rome. And for me, words are my relics. The thatched nipa huts, all of those, what the Filipinos have. For me, what the Filipinos have as a kind of ancestry and ancientness is language, because we've kept them. So that again became the play. And so I just reverting back to my main obsessions, language, and then it's actually I'm returning to my mom. I wrote about my mom very early in my short stories, and then I went and did novels. But to grasp my mom was so frightening to me, at the same time, I'm taking on an artistic project. The Return to Childhood is also an artistic project, in that I've never done this before. I don't consciously use real things. And so for me, that was also the challenge of doing it. So that's how I would kind of start with that.
And did you see, sort of returning to this 5 novels in and having raised a child to adulthood, that you could look at Rosario's relationship to her mother's history, and understand sort of, you could inhabit both perspectives, the adult daughter and, the older mother, and their estrangements in some ways?
Right. I would say that I almost like tunnel vision into the world of being the child. That's what I did with La Tercera, because it's something that I've had a more ideological relationship with my mom and her world. It's more political. I hated the Catholicism. I mean, the Catholicism was a problem. I mean, I like Catholicism in some ways, like being able to understand the churches of Rome. Yeah, that's good. But the politics, the classism, the attachment to fascism, so for me, my relationship to that, as with my mom, always was cut by my ideological horror. But what I did with this was I just went back to attachment, to something beyond ideology, motherhood beyond ideology, beyond the politics in some ways, and then trying to understand how that attachment, basically my love for my mother, I just came back to a love for her that kind of, with all of your education, all of your wanderings, all of your being in this very cosmopolitan place, is not remembered. And that came back to me so strongly because I missed her so much during the pandemic. I was like weeping every day thinking about my mom as I was writing this novel. There's a lot of weeping. So I just went back to childhood. And for me, that was what became the strength of the novel, that I took out the ideological underpinnings in some ways in that attachment and just tried to speak to that attachment, tried to articulate something that I think is very powerful because we don't understand it. I mean, one of the points I make in the novel is that a mother is just someone who's hard to know.
Yes, I love that line. Ciphers, all of us. And then when you're a mother, you become a cipher yourself to your child and to yourself, I think. And like how, it's just like, there's something unknowable about, creating another human being and raising another human being. It was so powerful what you're saying about, weeping and the yearning that happened in the pandemic. And it was something I wanted to ask you about. A line about weeping that's in the novel. And it has to do with the physical reaction that Rosario describes when she sees the islands from the sky, the sight of them, and how even when she's trying to play with language, or as you said, see language, words as relics, so she feels this feeling of weakness in her head and she starts to weep, thinking about those, the granular visions of those islands. And that really resonated with me too, because because my novel is sort of like, about actually, driving back. Your novel is sort of flying back of like, the low rolling mountains that I was trying to write about in Appalachia, where I grew up. And I see those sort of geologic formations is so integral to that sort of yearning, or as you said, sort of going down into that tunnel of like that childhood self. And in some ways, language and words are relics, but they're more malleable than landscape because you can play around with words as relics. They're sort of more in our power, but you can't move an island around and you can't move a mountain around. And I just wondered if you could talk about that in the novel, because I think Rosario as a writer can play around with the relics of language in a way that like the size of those islands and their physical location you can't move them,
Right. And there's no way out for you. That's where you're from. That's what those were that physicality of the landscape, especially. I mean, I was thinking about you with Take What You Need, and because it was also a kind of road trip. And then and I was moved by those moments where she's even the feeling of getting lost in the place where, why am I getting lost, in your novel. And yeah, it's this immovable aspect of geography and landscape, where for me, for instance, so we're here by the Tiber, very
Right.
ancient, very, Trastevere, we're above Trastevere. But, when I look at a river, all I think about is Himanglos, the river of my mom's hometown. It's kind of weird. I see the Arno, I see Himanglos. I see the Tiber, I see Himanglos. I see the Hudson, I see Himanglos. It's a weird thing. Even that immovable aspect is that it's movable in the sense that you always carry it with you.
Right.
I carry the landscape of river. For me, river. I love Venice because Venice is all water, but river. For me, I respond to it, in a way that's weirdly bodily,
Yeah.
and water, and especially I'm an island girl, so especially a landscape where there's water and land, water sandwiched with land. That for me is like that sandwich, not the tramezzino, but that sandwich, geographical sandwich. For me, it's so moving. But in terms of the fact that you can't, I do think that there is that interesting dichotomy that you always have it with you, and then when you see it, though,
Such a
because you're
physical
so separate,
reaction.
yeah, your body reacts in a way that even though she was drunk also in that moment, I think your body carries your land, just as your body carries your words, and you can't manipulate. You can manipulate it in words, but the land is itself. So I think the return home journey, where you see the seeming emeralds, jewels of the archipelagic. I've always been struck by how beautiful, an archipelagic land is. And at the same time, when you write about that archipelagic land, it's so hard. It's so hard to make it coherent,
Yeah. And I think there's a way that words, in terms of relics, or that you can also feel them in your body, remain abstract. Whereas like the physical sight, or seeing that land sandwiched between the water, it is so external. It's not internal in the same way that language remains, and I thought you captured that so beautifully. And then I want to ask you a question too about language, because I know that is something that, you return to a lot. And I would say from your first novel to this one, I've loved all of them, I'm such a fan, is that you have this really interesting way of talking about how words can reveal something about a speaker. And it's sort of like you have this way of talking about telling, about the art of telling. Like the novel talks about the act of choosing words. And I think that operates on so many levels. That's, two people, but it's also two languages. And there's these brutal colonial histories that influence the choices and sometimes the brutal ways that people treat each other. And I loved in that New York Times review that Bernard mentioned from Hari Kunzru, where he highlights that wry, wonderful line that stood out for me as well about the Spanishy things that get stuck like crud in my mom's ware. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
What I.
And I was wondering if you could tell us about sort of your investigation of those words that get stuck like crud in the spoken language of your characters, and sort of how that relates, as you see it, to sort of Filipino history, or even sort of like your own, work within it.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I say that words are like the relics of that Filipinos have, where again, like it's so palpable, the relics of Rome. But if you trace Filipino words and when they're used, etc., for me, it's always been so fascinating. What like that concept that I was telling this to the people here in the academy. The words for chair, table, things that you make. And it's something I just, kept thinking about as a kid. Cama, mesa, silla. Those are the words in Waray for bed, table, chair. Those are Spanish words. But
Right.
but our word for dream is ino. You know, we don't use the Spanish word for dream. We have a word for it. And so words for heart, kasing-kasing. It's a Waray word. The words that are in us, the words that make us are in Waray. The words that are made things are Spanishy. It's kind of funny. So these are the kinds of things I would think about as a kid. You know, it's like, why I'm learning Spanish? Why are all of these words Spanish? And why is that word? So I grew up with that kind of wondering. Even as I was a novelist, and we had a funny word, pachis. Pachis means enemy. And it's a funny word, like you're an enemy, you're my friend who's an enemy because you betrayed me in the game, usually in a game. So I also thought about, that's a Waray word. No one else seems to have that word, you know, because there are so many languages. And I tried to figure out where that's coming from, because ch is not a Filipino sound. It's, you know, it's a foreign sound. And I figured out where it came from. Apache. So this betrayer, friend who betrays, comes from an American word, Apache, which, you know, so you have the whole history of settler colonialism and how it's taken over in this island language, you know, left over probably from both colonizers, both the Spanish, because I think the Spaniards also used Apache in a weird way, and the Americans. And so a history of colonization lies in that one word, Apache. And of course, the Filipino would not say Pachi, because you always use the plural when you're taking on a cognate. Have you noticed that? You're a translator. You know, like in the Philippines, you don't say, okay, this is just me thinking about language. This is what I've been doing all my life from the time I was a kid. You don't say manzana in the Philippines. You say manzanas. One apple is one manzanas. You see that? You know, but an apple is not going to be in Tagalog. It's going to be in Spanish because it's not indigenous. You know, so lanzones, on the other hand, which is my favorite fruit, is not translatable. There's no other word for it, no. As far as I can tell.
Our mutual friend, the poet Joseph Legazpi, brought a book back for my kids when he was living in the Philippines that was in Tagalog. And I loved looking at it. You know, my like translator brain came on of which words I could kind of squint at them and see some sort of something that, you know, I could pull on my knowledge of Spanish. And as you said, there would be words that I felt like I couldn't make any sense of at all. And it was just such a fascinating language to look at, because some words have a Latinate element and some have no Latin element, and there they are in the same sentence, you know?
Yeah, right.
So,
and so as a kid, if you're kind of aware of these things, and also because you're really made aware of it because of school, because you're kind of regulated in school, regimented by language. You can only speak this language, you can't speak that, you'll be fine for speaking this language, et cetera, et cetera. And then one language has more clout than another. Tagalog has more clout than all of these kinds of things. Your language makes you aware of hierarchy, makes you aware of history, and all of these things. It just became a huge pleasure, because it's a kind of puzzle. It's always a logical puzzle for me, the words that I'm using. And so the novel ended up really just because it's about my child, about, you know, growing up, trying to figure out how to understand this world that I grew up in that loves fascism. The laity people, you know, so the bourgeois laity people. I ended up going back also to those very early kind of quarrels, wonderings that I had about language when I was a child. I didn't include all of them because there's too many.
Well, it was funny what you're saying, that, you know, thinking about like, you know, the love of fascism, which I think, you know, comes in this amazing word you put in. It was about midway into the novel, and Rosario's reacting. And she talks about system psychosis. Yeah. And I thought that was like such a interesting sort of compound word you had invented, system psychosis. And just thinking about that when you're thinking about like, you know, a sort of like excitement about, fascism and like military rule and, like sort of, whether that comes down to, but I love that you create a system psychosis as this compound single word where you were sort of taking something about like the psychic state of the country at a certain period in time and then turning it into this neologism. And I loved how often that happened in the novel where like, there would just be these words where I would just have to pause and just appreciate how, the careful thought you would put into sort of a playfulness with language, but also language as a way to sort of cope with things that can't be changed.
Right. Yeah. And that was a gradual thing with the quality of the mother in the novel, where she would just completely mix up words and she would just make up these words. So that is Adina and Guapa's word, system psychosis. And it does come from, again, it comes from thinking when I was a child, I found this word really weird. Schisto. He has schistosomiasis, cysto. So, and I never understood what the word was. It's a disease. It's an illness. It's a tropical illness where something bloats in your body. It comes from the water. It's a kind of worm, I think, that comes from the water, but it was just a common word. And so, and it was a joke word. He has, you ate too much, now you have cysto, stuff like that. But because there's so many our languages are several, you can create all of the cognates, you can just mess up the cognates and just put the English word with the Tagalog word but just put them together. I mean, that's kind of the fun of the fact that we had so many. And you could easily use it. You could easily move, because it's both a kind of character quality of the mother, when she says, system psychosis, as well as, as you're saying, it actually reverberates into the politics, into the history. And I think that's what happens all the time with the language plays that they're kind of random because they just come from the fact of growing up in a culture like that. They're kind of random, they're completely arbitrary, really. Pachis, for instance, that's just like, has nothing. It's just a funny word. But then when you go and look at it, every time, a word that messes you up moves into this bigger sphere, it's weird.
Yeah. And I think looking back at those etymologies, you sort of learn how there are these subtle forces at the words that people choose or that they default to because they hear it elsewhere, that does shape their worldview in a way.
Exactly.
And I think through the dialogue in this novel and in the earlier novels, but this novel is, and maybe because you were writing it in the pandemic, it is a book, it has to do it. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of the scope of the book, and how many scenes and how much is happening within the book. And, and it was that sort of writing in the pandemic, or because it was returning to childhood and writing, about these sort of like larger themes of, homeland and mothers that sort of can take over one's, every book to come. They're so big, they're so vast.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think, okay. So I had started a novel a while ago called William McKinley's World, and it was about two brothers, Jote and Paco, and one was going to be a revolutionary, one was going to be a collaborator, and one of them was going to kill the other. And I couldn't figure out who's going to kill the other, etc. But that was the story. So I wanted to just do a basic historical sequence. It was also practice, kind of. It was practice for doing kind of realism in a way that I thought might be interesting for me, to do a kind of post-colonial realism within the means that I had. But I really don't like realism. I mean, that's my problem. So I have a huge problem with the straight narrative. And I got really bored with the two brothers. But I wanted to finish. And so instead I finished Insurrecto. Insurrecto was a novel that came from the research that I had done for William McKinley's World. So Insurrecto was my recess from William McKinley's World. And then I went home before the pandemic happened. There was a festival. I went home and I was I don't know what happened. I was on the airplane, and it was exactly what you were talking about, being on the airplane, looking at the islands and just weeping. And I said, I can't be writing a novel about these men. I want to write a novel about this return. And I wanted to write a novel. I don't know why I wanted to write a novel about my mother, but I had already been doing a lot of research on her great uncle, this guy that she loved, that I also hated as a kid, because like, come on, he was this. My mom was very proud of him. He was this, he was that, he was ambassador, he was this. And I said, Mom, you're such a liar. You're a liar. You're a fantasist. You love Imelda. You're a fantasist. Anyway, so she was like, she had like an Imeldific quality in that she had this, like Imelda Marcos. Imelda Marcos created a whole fable of herself. And her fantasy drove her crimes, drove a criminal government. And that kind of thinking made me disattached from my mom's attachments to her own ancestry, because I thought it was classist. I thought it was like stupid bourgeois stuff, etc. But then I started researching this guy, her Lolo Paco, and he really was in the archives. He was a senator. I mean, basically, my mom wasn't lying. I thought she was lying, but she wasn't lying. But I thought that there were ways to understand the connection between her attachment and the Philippine history, especially under America. So I fused those things together. The biographical part, trying to understand the puzzle of my mother, which is the puzzle of a town that keeps voting for people that will kill them, that will not, in fact, help them. The attachment to glamour and fantasy. And then what is the relationship between that and the historical world from which the people that they love come. So he was one of the very early, he was actually the very first group of Filipinos sent to the United States. He was around 16 years old, 14, I forget, sent to the United States to study and later become a bureaucrat. So they were like the practice bureaucrats. They were called pensionados, 1903. So very early on, 1903, this guy, 1899 was the war, 1903 was already sent. What's the connection between that historical period, which no one talks about, that time when the Philippines changed from the Spanish attachment to the American fetish. And that fetishizing, I think, is constructed by genocide, in my view.
Yes. And I think with that earlier statement you were saying about how those fantasies can lead to genocide and the connection between false narratives, whether they're in the town or in a leader, and then how they can sort of lock in bad governments, and that those false narratives continue. We clearly have a problem with that in this country.
Yes.
It's certainly a case in Brazil. It certainly is a case with the Pinochet dictatorship and people who continue to romanticize dictatorship in Chile. Especially
and the Trump world too, and
voting for people who
to American, genocide and racism. So
yes, and voting for a political party that is going to only, lessen the length of your life, and yet the voting goes on, because I think there's all those fantasies. And I think I love international literature and reading books at other places, because it really does give you a window into histories everywhere, and these sort of patterns of the relationship between false narrative and fantasizing and military governments and government corruption. And so I think it can sometimes come into sharp relief in one political reality because you read about it in another. And that is something that I think I've loved reading in your books, because it reverberates with things, thinking about Chile, where I've been traveling for 20 years, Brazil, where I lived and have translated books, and in our country too. And so I think sometimes when you take the leap and read about another country's history, or even it's sort of like the collective psyche, you can see all these parallels that say something about human nature anywhere. But I'm going to stop because there have been some excellent questions. So I'm going to give you one. This is from David Siglos, and he is asking, you mentioned Filipino dreams, which got me thinking about Filipino terms for nightmare. Excuse me, I'm going to mispronounce this. Bagungo, Bagungo, Batibat, Yurang, and which, as far as I can tell, are not colonial terms. Can you talk more about what this means to you, that the dreams and nightmares of Filipinos, which is internal, often does not adopt colonial words?
Yeah, it's that thing that I was saying, that Filipinos have kept their tongue, kept their words for the things that make them, for the things that are inside, and for me, that kind of that resilience, or that insistence on the self, on center, on that kind of, on the self, on being who you are, using your language, keeping your language, I think has been central to the making of the Filipino, that people don't talk about, because people always talk about the colonized Filipino, but it's also important to recognize we kept our languages. We do Catholicism the way we do, so bullshit Catholicism. We do it the way we do it. There's a weird centering that we actually have that we don't talk about, because we tend to talk about all of the so-called the pathologizing of the colonized subject, which I think is very problematic, because the pathology is with the colonizer, in my view. As I said at the end of the novel, it is greed that is insane. It is that economic greed, it is that political violence that for me is insane. The pathologizing of the colonized subject that happens, amnesia, you have all of these words for the person who's colonized, there's actually a huge healthy aspect of the Filipino in the way we have kept our words. And I'd say that's where I'd go in terms of the dream, that the dream remains, that sense of self that is kind of the unconscious. Okay, we'll go into the Freudian with that. That remains. That's always been there. And I think Filipinos do center themselves. They're kind of narcissistic in that way, but I think it's healthy.
Yeah. And also hard to generalize, because, it may be, a sort of cultural characteristic, but then of course there's lots of people who, operate otherwise. There is, Ria has a comment. My great-grandfather was in that same class of pensionados in 1903. And that class was brought to St. Louis for infamous World's Fair of 1904.
Yeah, I did. I studied that. So I'm going to be honest, one of the things that I find really problematic are some of the tropes that we have in terms of our history. And this trope of the World's Fair of 1904 has been like, everyone because what happened in World's Fair is that the tribal groups were displayed in the so-called human zoo. And so that's a very common, so a lot of scholarship has been done on that, et cetera. And I didn't want to include it in my novel because so much has been done on it. It's like including, Imelda's shoes in a story about Imelda. It's like, but the fact is, it's true. That class would have did go. They were the ushers. So you're colonized, you become the usher, you're the one showing people. I mean, it's such an obscene scenario. You're showing people, your own people, as an object, and you're also an object. It's an obscene thing, and so I did get into it. I did include it, Ria. I did include the World's Fair. I didn't want to because so much has been done on it.
Well, this is another question from Charita Castro, and she says, Gina, your book is a gift. I agree. To see our language on paper is soul affirming. What archives did you go into to find more information on your Lolo, and how did you go about it? I found an uncle's records from 1919 when he migrated to the States. Also, what decision did you make in the use of language with the various dialects in the Philippines? If you are not a Tagalog speaker, one may not know you were shifting between the various dialects, or was Rural your default? When it is not a Tagalog-like word, something shifts in me because it reminds me of the richness of the country, but also how we were not one prior to the Spaniards.
Yeah, thank you so much, Charita. That's such a good point, that if you're aware of the language shifting, your own way of thinking about that history also shifts, because you're always being reminded of the multiplicity of the land that you're from, and that the land that you're from in many ways is, definitely a construction of the nationalists, a construction of the colonizer, a construction of the Tagalogs, and so on. So you become more aware of a kind of fractured fragment that's not, I think, negative of the country. I'm here, for instance, on Janiculum Hill, where the Risorgimento, 1849, with Garibaldi, and so if you think about Italy, how recent also is the unification of Italy. So they're also, like the Philippines, a country that maybe is produced, constructed. They find ways to unify themselves, Garibaldi being one of them, and the Philippines, Rizal is another. We've made our ways to find a unified country, Tagalog, having everyone know Tagalog, etc. So yeah, I do think that it was very deliberate. Waray is central to the novel. And even when there are whole swaths of dialogue that are in English, and you would think that, so they're not in like broken English, et cetera, et cetera. The reason why they're not in broken English, even though they're Waray, is that they're speaking Waray. You have to understand that they're speaking Waray when they are speaking to each other. But all of the words, all of the sentences are in English. You get that? So, but then when I'm moving into, so I make those, I'm very kind of clear. When the family's speaking to each other, they're actually talking in Waray. And then they make up words like system psychosis. When I use the Waray, or have a joke that connects it to Tagalog, etc. That moment is very deliberate in thinking about power, thinking about gender, thinking about history. So the language moments, when you notice them, are thinking about those externalities. But it's important to recognize that Waray is at the center, even when English is the language. And that is something that I'm very unapologetic about, that even the English, when I'm using English, Waray is the node.
And so you are translating that dialogue into your mind and trying to recreate in English the sensibility and the humor of people speaking in Waray. And I came across that a little bit because I think the Northern Appalachian dialect, which was what I grew up speaking, isn't really present in American literature. And I had such a hard time writing the dialogue. And it was interesting because in Ways to Disappear, I knew that the speakers who were in Rio de Janeiro were speaking in Portuguese, right?
Yes.
And I was translating the Portuguese into English in my mind, but somehow that was sort of easier than this language that doesn't actually, or this dialect that doesn't necessarily appear in American literature that much. And so it's like, well, you don't know how to represent it in a written language in English and written speech in English. And so you're sort of inventing as you go in a way, so that even if it doesn't manifest for the reader that that's your intention, that's the emotional truth for you as the writer as you're writing these scenes.
Yeah, that's and it's really important. And I think that's the thing that people often, they'll kind of misread your choice of words, why you're choosing something awkward. It sounds awkward in English, or because I know that Waray is very Filipino languages are gerund based, they're verb based. So the nouns are in verb form. So katurugan, for instance, would be like another word for bed, but it comes from the verb turog, sleep. So gerund-based syntax in English is funny. So anyway, so there's a lot of very, very specific choices of syntax even to kind of move into the waray.
And I think there's a humor that's particular to each language, or even the same speaker speaking, whether they are speaking in Tagalog, whether they're speaking waray, whether they're speaking in English. And so you're aware of how there are those shifts in humor and sensibility depending on the language. And I know if you're writing a book and you are imagining the speakers, you're thinking about how the humor would come up in the sort of innuendos of that language or that dialect. And it's so particular. And I think this book is so funny. And so you must have been thinking a lot, I would imagine, about those innuendos that are particular, and maybe why people hold on to language, because if they don't hold on to the dialect, they lose the humor that is only possible in that dialect.
Exactly. They lose a way of relating to their condition that is actually always multiple in its orientations, because it's always funny, it's always sad. It's like the simultaneity gets lost when the language isn't.
Well, there's like a linguistic shorthand that can happen in language. And if you don't have it, that shorthand has an intimacy to it, because everybody who speaks it shares that shorthand. And when you lose the shorthand, you lose that intimacy in a certain way.
Yeah, you lose it, you lose that relationship, you lose that kind of, intimacy is really, thank you so much. That's the word. Intimacy really is the piece there. When Charita, when you were saying that, I could see because I know Tagalog that there was a shift here, that's intimacy. I'm creating intimacy with that person who knows. And in terms of the question of archive, the United States government has material on the Philippine Commonwealth. So I got most of it from the archive of the American government on the early American period, and also from suggestions by scholars like Nerissa Balse. I think she's online. Her research. So I talked to scholars like Charita's husband Theo. So I talked to them. I won't do archival work the way an archivist actually does work, because I'm a novelist, I have to write my novels. But I go with the leads given to me by scholars.
There was one more question embedded in there. Was the question about thinking about this question of the information on your Lolo, and how did you go about finding it? So you went on leads from other scholars?
I found it. I mean, I Googled him. His real name is Francisco Afan Delgado. I gave him, just because he's fictional. I made him Francisco Bloomfeld Delgado. I gave him Bloomfeld. That's a Kafka name. I don't know if you know Bloomfeld, an elderly bachelor. So there's a lot of collaging in this novel, so there's Kafka in his name and all of that. Because anyway,
Bloomfeld's a Jewish name.
Yes, it is. It is. So I have him. There's a kind of weird little riff that I do on the musician who arrives in Samar and then disappears, and he just leaves his name, Bloomfeld. Adina Bloomfeld, what's her name again? Ikatalago, ABC, that's her name. So that's one, the US government, what's in the archives of government officials. But there were a lot of things I found, I thought very interesting stuff of, for instance, very early Filipino feminists, during the American period, who were, I think they were part of the progressive movement in the United States, Bostonians in particular, Boston people, etc. So one of the central characters becomes this person who actually translates the ancestors, the grandfathers' diaries and journals. She's in love with one of them, but she's a feminist. She believes in being herself, but she came from a study of early Filipino feminists in the American, around 1909 or so, that were part of the women's movements in the United States. So I thought that was also interesting. But again, thinking about the divide between the Filipino who's made an object of, even in, a fetishized by a progressive establishment. And there were also there's so many stories that one could cull from this history that just merges so many different cultures, so many political histories, the history of anarchism, the history of feminism, all of these things. So yeah.
Well, do we have any last questions from anyone? If you want to put them up, we're happy to maybe take time for one more question. Gina, was there anything you wanted to talk about we didn't get to?
I'm looking at let's see. So Ria was bringing up the 1904.
I think I got all of them. I hope.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, I actually wanted to ask you also, because you brought up, as the issue of translation and ways in which for your novel, because it's the English of the Appalachians also, trying to translate that into English without becoming, without the being happy, being okay with awkwardness, of the language. I was interested because you're also a translator. So what was that like?
Well, what was interesting, I love your books in part because I think you think a lot about sort of linguistic subordination and how one way to subordinate people is to do so linguistically, and how one way of being insubordinate is also through language. And how language can be an act of rebellion, and how if someone is intending to subordinate Waray or subordinate Tagalog, and holding on to those words is an act of insubordination, and I think that's the interesting thing that translation allows. But I love that interest in sort of the rebellious nature of words and which ones we use and which ones we hold on to. I love that. And I think you write about it with such humor, and joy. And even when you're talking about the words now, you're smiling and laughing because there is something mischievous about making words like, system psychosis and making up these words and the wordplay. I think it's fun, but there is also something capricious about it, Yeah. And I think for Take What You Need, I had just for so long had been working on, translating other languages. And so this was the first time I'd gone back to try and recreate what I spoke growing up. And it, took me probably 10 books and in different genres before I felt like I could do that in a way that wasn't caricature, and that in a way that had joy to it and wasn't overplayed or heavy-handed. I wanted to do it subtly. Because I think what you do is quite subtle. The way that they're speaking Waray in English, you don't draw undue attention to it. You're not overusing it. Right. Because then it wouldn't sound convincingly a speech,
Yeah, I had to actually, when I was listening to the audio person who was going to do the audio, and the automatic reversion into using Filipino accent to speak the words in English, when in fact they're supposed to be speaking Waray, so you would just speak normal English because they're speaking normal Waray. And how interesting it was for me to recognize, like I instantly, no, you don't use the Filipino accent, just say it in normal English because they're just speaking normal Waray.
Right.
So just like,
you just want to show their fluency and their intimacy and the quick back and forth, and drawing too much attention to it,
because no way would they be speaking extensively in English. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and I think that's why the dialogue is so vibrant and funny, is because you were just not trying to make a point with it. You were just letting them be in the moment and enjoy interacting with each other. And then it becomes a pleasure to read as a result.
It is interesting because you create the solutions on your own as you're doing it. You know, it's not like you're thinking about it. You're just saying, this does not sound, I will not do that. I won't do a broken English. I won't do the accent. I won't do that. I will only do the accent if they're actually speaking in English, but they're waray.
Right.
Because that makes sense.
Yeah.
If let's say insurrecto, when the two soldiers are speaking to the Americans, they're speaking English to the Americans in their English. So the accent is going to be there.
Right. Right.
Now, Rizal, Jose Rizal, one of the puzzles that people have had about Jose Rizal is that I realized he was doing the same shit. He had to solve problems writing in Spanish, but he knows that they're speaking in Tagalog.
Right.
Because Ben Anderson actually asked that question. Why is it that Doña Consolacion speaks straight, elegant Spanish?
Right.
Well, she's speaking Tagalog, but it just occurred to me that is the issue of translation and the solving of the issues of language. We've been doing it for a long time because we've been writing, of course, not if you're writing in Tagalog. I think even if you're writing in Tagalog, because you have to deal with people who are speaking in English. If you're a Tagalog writer and you're writing completely in Tagalog, you still have to deal with the English.
Right.
So the Filipino English writer deals with all, so, and we're always making those negotiations. And the reason why it's fascinating to me to bring this up is that is also the way we live.
Yeah.
We just live with this porous sense of words and multiple moves. Immediately, you can go into Waray or go into English, without skipping a beat,
Right.
as a Pinoy, as a Waray person. And then it gets translated into the art that you do,
Yes.
That's interesting.
I love this conversation, Gina. Excited to see you when you get back from Rome and you hear all about it.
I am excited.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For answers, so many things to sort of chew on and think about. It was really.
And you have to come to Rome.
Thank you to Gina and to Idra for such a wonderful and enlightening conversation, as was expected from two of my favorite writers. Very wonderful. And also I would like to thank the audience who took their time out of their day to really watch this amazing conversation take place. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this. And we cannot continue to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So please support Gina Apostol and Idra Novey and Politics and Prose by using the links in the chat to purchase their books. Check our website for the most current updated event listings, as we have a great list to choose from. We do hope to see you all again here, and thank you for joining us today. Once again,
Congrats,
thank you to Gina.
What a wonder. Loved it.
Thank you so much, Idra.